What would you do if the person you trusted most invited their lover to your own child's birthday party? This is not just a story about betrayal. It's about a father who refused to be humiliated and took back control of his life. In this video, you'll witness deception exposed, dignity reclaimed, and the powerful reminder that betrayal always comes with a price. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy dramatic true stories filled with twists and lessons, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's step into the story of She Invited Her Lover to Our Child's Birthday. I Took Back Control. He first noticed it in the small, ordinary places where love usually lives. The clatter of forks at dinner. The squeak of Lily's chair as she rocked while telling him about a picture she had drawn at school. The way James clapped whenever the oven light clicked on and cookies appeared like small moons. Melissa used to watch these moments with a smile that touched the corners of her eyes. Lately, her gaze slid past him, toward the small rectangle glowing on the counter. She laughed at something that wasn't in the room, then set the phone face down as if it needed sleep. He told himself not to be dramatic. Work had been relentless. He had started measuring his days in deliverables and deadlines, carrying the weight home in his shoulders. Maybe he had turned dinners into refueling stops. Maybe he had grown dull. When Melissa said she was staying late to organize classroom materials for a literacy night, he nodded and told her to drive safe. When she came home with the smell of someone else's cologne tucked into the fibers of her sweater, he convinced himself it was the copy room or a parent volunteer, the kind of contamination that came from crowded spaces and fluorescent light. Absence, he learned, does not announce itself with a slamming door. It arrives gradually, like a temperature drop you can't name until you're shivering. Melissa stopped telling him the small weather reports of her day. She poured wine without offering him a glass. She responded to the kids in efficient bursts, as if love were a task you could tick off and forget. In the evenings, she sat at the table as if it were a raft, her thumb moving under the surface of the phone, her eyes hovering somewhere a few inches left of his face. He tried to bridge the distance with ordinary kindness. He bought her favorite jasmine tea. He fixed the wobbly leg on the dining chair she always avoided. He set timers to remind himself to step away from his laptop before she got home so he could meet her at the door like he used to. For a week, he managed. He cooked. He listened. He asked open-ended questions. Melissa answered in sentences that sounded like receipts. Fine, busy, tired. Then the phone would hum and her mouth would soften in a way it hadn't for him in months. One night he found her in the living room with the lights off, the TV on mute, blue light painting her face. The house was quiet except for the dishwasher and the soft rattle of James's cough in the hallway. "You okay?" he asked. Her shoulders jumped. "I didn't hear you," she said, and then, "It's nothing." He stood there long enough to know it was something, and then he told himself to let it go because marriage requires faith, and faith is believing in things you cannot see. He went to bed and lay awake with his heart in his throat while the empty space on her side of the mattress glowed like a vacancy sign. It began on one of those evenings where silence felt heavier than words. The children had been tucked into bed, their laughter still clinging faintly to the walls, and Ethan lingered in the living room with Melissa, waiting for her to meet his eyes. But she didn't. Her thumb traced the rim of her wine glass, her gaze fixed on a spot that seemed to exist beyond him, beyond their home, beyond their years together. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, stripped of warmth, like a candle blown out in the middle of a storm. "I don't feel the spark anymore," she said. The words dropped into Ethan's chest like a stone falling into still water, sending ripples through every memory he thought was unshakable. Anniversaries, quiet walks after dinner, sleepless hospital nights holding newborns with trembling hands. In that instant, all of it felt fragile, breakable. His first thought wasn't anger, it was failure. Had he stopped trying? Had he become too predictable, too consumed by long hours at work? Was he simply too ordinary to keep her interested? He searched her face desperately for tenderness, for even the smallest flicker of the woman who once looked at him as if he were enough. But what he saw was rehearsed detachment, the expression of someone who had practiced this line in a mirror until it no longer stung her own heart. "I can fix this," he said quickly, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. His mind raced ahead of his fear. A date night, a weekend getaway, little gestures to remind her of who they had been before exhaustion turned their marriage into survival. He offered them like lifelines, but Melissa shook her head slowly, exhaling a sigh that sounded more like a verdict than a breath. "It's too late." Those 3 words hollowed him out. Too late for what? Too late for forgiveness, too late for counseling, or too late because her heart already belonged elsewhere. Ethan didn't know, but suspicion began to gnaw at the edges of his thoughts, sharp and merciless. In the days that followed, he tried anyway. He brought home her favorite takeout. He left small notes on the counter with silly doodles that once made her laugh. He reached for her hand in the car. Each gesture was met not with cruelty, but with something worse, politeness. Acknowledgement without intimacy. A faint smile, an absent nod, eyes that were always somewhere else. And then came the moment that cracked him further. One night he caught her typing quickly into her phone, the corners of her mouth curling into a secret smile. When he asked what she was doing, she tilted the screen away and said, "Just checking in with a friend." The lie wasn't in the words, it was in the way she avoided his gaze. Later, he lay awake in the dark, listening to the rhythm of her breathing beside him. His mind replayed every sign he had dismissed, every shadow he had explained away. Was this simply the slow erosion of marriage, the natural decay of passion over years? Or was there something darker corroding the foundation of their life together, an unseen betrayal quietly pulling her farther from him? He couldn't tell yet. But for the first time, he felt the ground tilt beneath him, and the word she had spoken, spark, burned like an accusation. If it was gone, who had stolen it? It happened on a day so ordinary it should have been forgettable. A Tuesday afternoon, the house alive with the familiar noises of children unpacking their school bags, Melissa moving through the kitchen, the faint hum of the dishwasher. Ethan reached for her phone, not with suspicion, but with routine. He had left his watch upstairs, and he wanted to check the time before running the bath for James. That was when the screen lit up in his hand. "I love you. Can't wait to see you." 14 words, simple, sharp, each one slicing through the thin layer of denial he had wrapped around himself. His chest tightened, his throat closed. For a split second, he told himself it must have been a mistake, a misdirected message. But then Melissa looked up from the stove, and the smile on her lips wasn't accidental. It was the kind of smile that belonged to someone who knew exactly who had written those words. Curiosity drowned hesitation. With trembling hands, Ethan swiped the screen open and found himself stepping into a world he hadn't even known existed. Hundreds of messages stretched back for months, threads woven with intimacy and promises, stolen hours disguised as errands. Pet names he had never heard, jokes that had never been his, fantasies and plans whispered in a language that excluded him entirely. He scrolled, each new line another cut to the life he thought was solid. Vacations they had dreamed of taking together, now imagined with another man. Tenderness he thought had vanished, poured freely into Derek Cole. The man had a name now. The faceless fear Ethan had carried in his chest finally revealed itself in letters glowing cruelly from the screen. Melissa hadn't been drifting. She had been pulled, anchored, cherished by someone else. Rage flared hot in his veins, his hands shaking with the urge to storm into the kitchen and hold the phone in her face, to demand how 8 years of marriage, 2 children, and countless sacrifices could dissolve into secret declarations of love typed into a glowing rectangle. But beneath the fury, something colder rose, clarity. He finally had proof, not suspicion, not paranoia, proof that could not be twisted or explained away. His breath came ragged, but his mind sharpened. He began taking screenshots. Line after line, each message preserved, time-stamped, cataloged with the precision of a man preparing for battle. He stored them in a hidden folder only he could access. Every word was a weapon now, every emoji another nail in the coffin of the lies Melissa had built. When she hummed softly while rinsing plates, Ethan sat at the table and watched her, his expression unreadable. She moved like nothing had changed, like their life together was intact. But Ethan knew the truth. His wife was living a second life, and he was merely an extra on her stage. That night, as the children slept upstairs, Ethan lay in the dark beside her. Melissa's breathing was steady, unbothered. His mind, however, was ablaze. Every late night, every excuse, every cold smile rearranged itself in the harsh light of truth. He wanted to scream. He wanted to wake her, demand answers, burn everything down with one confrontation. But he didn't. He chose silence, not surrender, but strategy. Explosions end quickly. Wars are won with patience. For the first time since suspicion had begun to gnaw at him, Ethan felt a flicker of control. His marriage might be collapsing, but he would choose how it fell. The night after Ethan discovered the truth, he lay stiff on the mattress beside Melissa. Her face glowed faintly from the light of a secret world she scrolled through, her lips curving at words that weren't his. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. The fury inside him was molten, pressing against his ribs, ready to erupt. But he cooled it, shaped it, forced it into something harder than fire, steel. Explosions, he reminded himself, end quickly. Wars are won by those who plan. The next morning, while Melissa hummed over the coffee pot as if their life hadn't fractured, Ethan slipped into his car and dialed the number of a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he scheduled a consultation. That single call shifted something deep inside him. He was no longer just a wounded husband. He was a man drawing a battle map. In the days that followed, he built a quiet network of preparation. A second attorney for comparison to ensure no strategy was missed. A financial advisor to trace hidden accounts. An old college friend who had survived a brutal custody fight. Each conversation added another weapon to his arsenal, another layer of defense against the woman who still believed she had the upper hand. He learned how hesitation could be costly. If he filed too slowly, Melissa could twist the narrative, cast herself as the victim, or worse, move assets out of reach. Ethan would not allow that. At home, Melissa mistook his calm for indifference. When she smiled at her phone, convinced she was clever, he let her. When she left her laptop open, he moved quietly, capturing photographs of conversations, credit card bills, and email chains. Nights became reconnaissance missions. Forgotten notebooks yielded passwords. Bank statements revealed discrepancies. He charted the dates of her school events against receipts from restaurants he had never visited. Every discovery added another brick to the fortress he was constructing in silence. And through it all, he practiced patience. The eerie calm gave him power. Every minute Melissa thought she was deceiving him was a minute he spent sharpening his weapons. One evening, he closed his laptop and simply watched her from across the room. To Melissa, his quiet gaze might have looked like defeat. To Derek, if he had known, it might have seemed like surrender. But Ethan's stillness was neither. In his mind, he was dismantling the stage she had built, lie by lie, brick by brick. She thought she was winning the game. She had no idea the war had already begun. And Ethan, for the first time, was learning how to win it. Ethan waited until the house was wrapped in silence, the kind that left no excuses and no escape. Upstairs, the children's soft breathing filled the rooms like fragile music, and Melissa sat downstairs on the couch, her phone face down on the table, her fingers twitching as though they longed to reach for it. He watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then his voice cut through the stillness. "Are you seeing someone else?" The words were delivered with a calm so sharp it felt like a blade sliding across glass. Melissa froze, her face drained of color. Her mouth opened, then shut again as if the air itself had betrayed her. The silence stretched, almost unbearable, broken only by the quick, shallow rhythm of her breathing. Finally, she whispered, "Yes." Ethan's chest tightened, but his expression remained still, controlled. She flinched at that composure. Anger she could have handled. She had prepared herself for it, maybe even rehearsed defenses against shouting and rage. But this stillness, this unmovable calm, it terrified her. It's been 6 months, she added quickly, her voice trembling as though length could soften the weight of betrayal. His name is Derek Cole. He understands me. He's the deepest emotional connection I've ever had. Every word was a shard of glass pressed deeper into Ethan's chest, but he did not give her the satisfaction of seeing him bleed. He sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap as she rushed on, piling excuses into the space his silence carved open. I was lonely. I needed passion. I didn't feel seen anymore. Her justifications fell like ash, brittle and empty. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was steady, low, and precise. And the children, did you think of them while you were searching for passion? Melissa's face twisted, guilt and defiance colliding in her expression. This isn't about them, she snapped softly. This is about us, about what we lost. What you lost, Ethan corrected, his eyes cold, his tone cutting like ice. Then she spoke the words that made his blood freeze. I need to see him one last time for closure. Ethan leaned forward, his voice sharp enough to shatter the illusion she had built. If he matters that much, pack your bags and live with him. Oh, the line struck harder than any shout ever could. Melissa faltered. Her carefully crafted narrative crumbled in her hands. She had expected anger. She had expected begging. But she had not prepared for this, a man who no longer played her script. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. For the first time since her affair began, Melissa realized she wasn't holding the power. The man she thought she controlled now looked at her as if she were already a stranger. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, the soft shift of Lily turning in her sleep. The sound tethered them both back to reality. 2 children, 1 house, a family cracking apart under the weight of betrayal. Ethan rose from the couch without another word. He left her sitting in silence, clutching her phone like a lifeline while he climbed the stairs to check on his children. That night, Melissa stayed alone in the dark, her mind racing, her heart pounding. The script she had written for her betrayal no longer worked. Ethan hadn't exploded. He hadn't begged. He had drawn a line so sharp that even she could see it, Derek or her family. And in that moment, Melissa finally understood Ethan's calm was not weakness. It was strength. And it terrified her. The confession had detonated in the middle of their living room, but the shockwave lingered long after. The silence between them was no longer neutral. It was sharp, unbreathable, a battlefield waiting for the next strike. Ethan let it stretch, heavy enough for Melissa to feel its weight pressing down. Then, with a voice that carried no tremor, he drew the line. There will be no contact with Derek, he said, his tone low but resolute. Not a text, not a call, not even one last meeting for closure. Melissa's arms folded across her chest in a posture of defiance, her chin tilted upward, her eyes sparking with a challenge. You can't dictate who I talk to, she snapped. You're being controlling. The accusation was sharp, designed to pierce his resolve, to twist him into doubt, but Ethan did not flinch. His gaze was steady, his voice firm. This isn't about control, it's about survival. If you want this marriage to exist in any form, if you want even the slightest chance at rebuilding, then transparency isn't optional, it's required. Full access to your phone, your email, your calendar, no secrets, no shadows. Melissa scoffed, her head shaking as if the very thought was absurd. That's not a marriage, she hissed. That's a prison. Ethan's reply cut through her protest like steel. A prison you built. You don't get to betray our vows and then rewrite the rules for recovery. If Derek matters more, then go live with him. Pack your things and don't look back. For the first time, fear flickered across her face. She hadn't expected this version of him. She had imagined a man who would rage, who would shout and then collapse into apologies, desperate to hold on. But this Ethan, calm, unyielding, speaking with the weight of finality, was a stranger she couldn't manipulate. I said I want us to work on this, Melissa muttered, her voice softer now, though the edge of defiance still glowed beneath it. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers, every syllable carrying the weight of truth. Then prove it. Because right now I don't see a partner. I see someone trying to live in 2 worlds, your family and your affair, and thinking you can juggle them without consequence. That ends tonight. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She said nothing, but the silence was not surrender. Ethan could see it in the restless twitch of her hands, the stubborn angle of her jaw. The defiance still smoldered, like a coal refusing to die out. Later that night, when Melissa disappeared into the bedroom with her phone clutched tightly in her hand, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. He looked down at the notes he had started keeping, a growing list of boundaries and rules he would enforce with or without her consent. Boundaries weren't just demands. They were the last scaffolding holding up a house already gutted by fire. And if she could not live within them, then the house would collapse, and Ethan would be the one to let it fall. For the first time in months, clarity filled his lungs like oxygen. Whatever came next, he would not walk into it blindly. The choice might be hers, but the strength to enforce it, that was his alone. The office was designed to feel safe. Muted earth tones softened the walls, a bowl of polished stones rested on the side table, and lamps spread a warm glow that erased sharp shadows. Ethan sat stiffly in one chair, Melissa in another, angled toward a woman with kind eyes and a notepad balanced on her lap. "So, Melissa," the counselor began gently, "tell me how we got here." Melissa exhaled as though stepping onto a stage. Her voice carried a practiced weariness. "It's been hard," she said, her tone careful, almost rehearsed. "The stress, the kids, Ethan's long hours at work. I felt invisible. I guess I just drifted." Ethan kept his gaze fixed on her, his face unreadable. To an outsider, her story might have sounded compelling, a wife neglected, starved of affection, lost in the storm of modern marriage. She punctuated her sentences with sighs, tilted her head just so, leaned into the language of regret. To the therapist, it might have looked like vulnerability. To Ethan, it was choreography when the counselor pressed her. "But you made a choice, Melissa. Can you take responsibility for that choice?" Her eyes flickered. She shifted in her seat, wrapped her arms tightly around herself, then whispered, "I wasn't looking for it. Derek was just there. He listened. He cared. It wasn't supposed to happen." Derek, his name slipped into the room like a stain, souring the air. Ethan noted every deflection, the way she circled back to his work hours, how she emphasized stress and circumstance instead of betrayal, how she painted herself as a victim of loneliness instead of admitting to deliberate choices. And when the session ended, Ethan noticed something else. The way Melissa's hand twitched toward her purse before she even stood, as if the real comfort waited in the glow of her phone. On the drive home, silence filled the car. Melissa stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. When her phone buzzed in her lap, she angled the screen away, but not quickly enough. Ethan caught the faint bloom of a smile spreading across her lips before she pressed it back down. Therapy wasn't a bridge, it was theater. Melissa wasn't cutting Derek out. She was weaving him deeper into the fabric of her double life, convinced that Ethan's patience was weakness. But Ethan wasn't fooled. He had stopped searching for remorse. Instead, he documented everything. The contradictions, the blame shifting, the way her words inside therapy never matched her behavior outside it. She thought she was buying time, balancing two worlds, practicing her script in front of a professional witness. But Ethan was rehearsing something else entirely. The day he would drop the curtain on her performance and reveal the truth she could no longer spin. Ethan had rehearsed the moment in his mind for weeks, every detail timed like a chess move he refused to misplace. He had gathered evidence, endured therapy's theater, and listened to Melissa's lies long enough to understand one truth: there was nothing left to salvage. The children deserved stability, and he deserved freedom. The opportunity arrived on a quiet weekend when Lily and James were with their grandparents. The house was still, deceptively peaceful, as Melissa busied herself at the kitchen table. A half-finished glass of wine stood beside her laptop, its screen glowing with the world she had chosen over him. The knock at the door was ordinary, almost gentle. Melissa rose, expecting a delivery or perhaps a neighbor. But when she opened it, a man in a suit stood waiting, a folder tucked neatly in his hand. "Melissa Walker?" he asked. "Yes." He placed the envelope into her hands. "You've been served." The words echoed through the hallway like a verdict. Melissa froze, staring down at the papers that suddenly weighed more than anything she had ever held. Her smile faltered, her face shifting from confusion to denial and finally to horror. She turned toward Ethan, her voice cracking. "What is this?" Ethan stood calm, his posture unshaken. "Divorce papers," he said. His tone carried no anger, no triumph, just certainty. Melissa's hands trembled as she flipped through the first pages, her eyes scanning words that dismantled the life she thought she controlled. "We can fix this," she pleaded, her voice desperate now. "Ethan, please, think of the kids, don't do this to them." He shook his head, firm but quiet. "I am thinking of them, that's why I'm doing this." The answer shattered her last defense. For months she had mistaken his stillness for weakness, his composure for surrender. But in that moment, she understood it had been preparation all along. Later that evening, Richard Matthews arrived unannounced. Melissa's father had always respected Ethan, their bond built through years of family dinners and shared responsibilities. He found Ethan sitting alone on the porch, staring out into the dusk. "I heard," Richard said softly. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. Richard's voice carried the weight of both love and bitter disappointment. "You're doing the right thing. I'll always love my daughter, but I see what she's done, and I see what it's cost you." Grief swelled in Ethan's chest, sharp and heavy, but Richard's words steadied him. Melissa's fantasy, that Ethan would orbit her forever, bound by vows she had already broken, was collapsing. She wasn't facing a desperate husband clinging to scraps of affection. She was facing a man who had chosen dignity over illusion and who now severed the bond she thought was indestructible. Inside the house, Melissa sat alone at the kitchen table, tears dripping onto the stark black print of legal documents. Outside, Ethan breathed in the cool evening air, his resolve hard as stone. The first decisive blow had been struck, and there would be no turning back. The papers had been served, but the walls of the house still bound them together. Until the court finalized custody and division, Ethan and Melissa lived under the same roof, moving like ghosts who had once known each other but now drifted in separate orbits. Ethan relocated to the spare room at the end of the hall, a narrow space once used for storage. The first night Lily asked why Dad wasn't sleeping in the big room anymore, Ethan gave her the gentlest truth he could. "Mommy and Daddy need some space while we figure things out." She accepted it with a small nod, already distracted by her doll. James barely asked at all, but for Ethan, the fracture was carved deep into every silence. Melissa tested boundaries daily. Some mornings she dropped sarcastic remarks about how he looked happier living like a roommate. Other times, she dangled guilt, whispering about the children's future, painting him as the villain for tearing the family apart. And when guilt didn't work, she tried sparks of conflict, baiting him with petty arguments about bills, groceries, misplaced laundry. Her voice rose sharp and cutting, hoping to drag him back into the cycle of rage. Ethan answered with stillness. The gray rock, unreactive, immovable. He refused to give her the fuel she sought. Instead, he poured himself into the children. He cooked meals they loved, inventing silly names for pasta dishes, turning pancake flips into a game until Lily's laughter filled the kitchen. He helped James build towers of blocks, clapping loudly when they crashed to the floor. Homework was done at the dining table, bedtime stories delivered with voices that made them giggle until their cheeks hurt. At night, when the house quieted, Ethan turned his energy inward. Running shoes hit the pavement under the glow of streetlights. In the garage, weights clanged against concrete, each repetition burning away helplessness, carving him into someone stronger. Sweat became his medicine. Discipline replaced chaos. Friends began to notice. One colleague clapped him on the shoulder at the gym. "You look different, stronger. Whatever you're doing, keep at it." Ethan only nodded, but inside he felt the truth of it. The same discipline that once kept him enduring Melissa's distance was now rebuilding him piece by piece. Melissa noticed too. She saw how the children leaned toward him, how neighbors greeted him warmly, how he walked through the house with quiet certainty instead of desperation. Every attempt at manipulation slid off him like water on stone. Once she had held his heart in her fist. Now she couldn't even provoke him into raising his voice. Their cohabitation became a study in contrast, one shrinking deeper into shame and secrecy, the other rising from ashes into something unrecognizable. Ethan didn't celebrate it, but he embraced it. The battle was no longer about keeping a marriage alive. It was about showing his children what resilience looked like when betrayal tried to destroy a family. And in that silent war under one roof, Melissa finally learned what terrified her most. It wasn't Ethan's anger. It was his indifference. By late spring, the air inside the Walker house had thickened, heavy with tension that clung to the walls like dampness. Ethan counted the weeks until the court date, focusing on endurance, on his children, on holding the pieces together until the system carved them apart. When Lily's 7th birthday approached, Ethan planned a small, tender gathering. His sister offered her backyard, and he filled it with balloons, a castle-shaped cake baked late into the night, and laughter that spilled into the grass. Lily's eyes sparkled as she blew out the candles, James clapping furiously at her side. For Ethan, it was enough. His daughter was celebrated, surrounded by the people who loved her most. But Melissa wanted more, or rather, she wanted a stage. A week later, she announced she would host the real party at the family home. She spoke of classmates and neighbors, of relatives and decorations, as if organizing an exhibition rather than a celebration. Ethan recognized the maneuver instantly. It wasn't for Lily, it was for control. And then he saw the guest list. Derek's name stared back at him from the page. The realization twisted his stomach. To invite her affair partner into their daughter's birthday was not only cruelty, it was strategy. A calculated humiliation designed to parade Derek before family and neighbors, to normalize his presence, to force Ethan into silence or absence. The trap was obvious. If Ethan attended, he would stand like a ghost in the background, forced to watch as Melissa and Derek played host in the house he had built. If he refused to show up, Melissa could twist the narrative. He didn't even bother to come to his own daughter's birthday. Either choice dripped with poison. For nights, Ethan lay awake, turning it over in his mind. He imagined Lily searching for his face in the crowd, confusion clouding her joy. He imagined Derek smiling smugly in the backyard, planting himself in the space that had once been Ethan's. Rage burned in his chest, a flame so bright he had to clench his fists to keep it from spilling out. But then clarity settled over him. This was more than a family gathering. This was psychological warfare. He would not give Melissa the satisfaction of watching him unravel. He would not allow Derek to stand in his house as if he belonged there. Nor would he abandon Lily to whispers about a father who didn't show up. So he made his decision. He would attend, yes, but on his own terms, not Melissa's. He would not shout. He would not break. He would carry himself with dignity, with restraint, with the quiet force of a man who refused to be scripted into humiliation. Melissa, smiling to herself as she hung streamers in the living room, believed she had orchestrated a masterpiece. She thought she would watch Ethan crack, crumble, and crawl. What she didn't realize was that Ethan had already decided how the play would end. The morning of Lily's birthday party broke bright and clear, but Ethan's stomach carried the weight of a storm. He had already chosen his strategy. Today would not be Melissa's show. It would be his quiet refusal to play her script. He dressed deliberately, selecting a crisp shirt and dark jeans. Nothing extravagant, nothing careless, just sharp enough to project control. He wrapped Lily's gift with care, tucking it under his arm like a promise, and drove toward the house that still smelled of his children's laughter and his own labor. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw it. Derek's car parked crookedly along the curb. The sight twisted something deep in his chest, but he smothered the fire before it could rise. Anger was the reaction Melissa wanted. Today, she would not get it. He walked quietly through the backyard gate. The scene before him was almost comical. Melissa and Derek were fumbling with tape and balloons, stringing up decorations like guilty teenagers pretending to be innocent. Melissa's eyes widened when she saw him. Derek's hands stilled, his gaze dropping to the grass, the streamer sagging between his fingers. Ethan smiled, calm and deliberate. "Morning," he said evenly. He extended the wrapped gift toward Melissa. "This is for Lily. I'll be giving it to her later at your parents' house." Melissa blinked, stunned. You're not staying." "No," Ethan replied simply. His tone was flat, certain. "I wanted to give her this in person, but I won't be part of this." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouted argument. Derek avoided eye contact, his shoulders curling inward as though the earth itself might swallow him. Melissa's voice softened, almost pleading, her confidence cracking. "Ethan, please, for Lily, just stay. We can get through this without drama." Ethan shook his head slowly, his expression unyielding. "No, this is drama. You created it, and I won't play a role in it." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. Ethan gave her one last look, not of rage, not of grief, but of dismissal. Then he turned on his heel, the wrapped gift still in his hand, and walked out of the backyard. His steps were steady, his head high, every motion broadcasting strength. Later, when the party began, his absence roared louder than his presence ever could have. Guests whispered about the tension. Relatives noted the strange distance between Melissa and Derek, the way she hovered without ever daring to stand beside him for long. Derek, ignored and uncomfortable, spent most of the afternoon retreating indoors, fidgeting with his phone. Aunts and uncles exchanged looks, muttering the word classless under their breath. Neighbors raised eyebrows, their conversations laced with pity for Lily and judgment for Melissa. At her parents' house later that day, Ethan presented Lily with the gift. Her eyes lit up, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck. In that moment, her joy was all that mattered. By refusing to enter Melissa's trap, Ethan had rewritten the script. His silence, his absence, his dignity, these became his weapons. And while Melissa tried to craft her illusion of control, everyone else saw the truth. The marriage was broken, but Ethan's strength remained intact, untouchable. The backyard should have been filled with celebration, streamers fluttering, balloons swaying, laughter spilling over the fences. Melissa had imagined it as her moment of triumph, the perfect showcase of a new chapter. She had planned every detail with surgical precision, a unicorn-shaped cake, rented tables, cheerful music humming from a speaker. On the surface, it looked like a party, but beneath the bright colors, unease simmered like smoke. From the moment the first guests arrived, the illusion began to fracture. Derek lingered near the sliding glass door, a drink clenched tightly in his hand, his posture rigid. He smiled awkwardly at those who passed by, but no one lingered long enough to respond. Relatives gave curt nods and turned away. Neighbors exchanged whispers behind paper plates of cake. Even Melissa's colleagues glanced at each other with raised brows, their silence sharper than words. Melissa floated between groups, her smile stretched too wide, her laugh pitched just a little too high. She introduced Derek as a friend, her tone casual, rehearsed. But whispers threaded through the crowd, relentless and cutting. "Isn't that the man from her school?" one aunt murmured. "Classless," another relative muttered, shaking her head. Every sideways glance tightened the noose around Melissa's performance. Where she had pictured admiration, she found discomfort. Where she had hoped for validation, she found disdain. Derek wasn't her knight in shining armor. He was a shadow, an intruder tolerated only out of politeness. Unable to withstand the stares, Derek retreated inside, scrolling through his phone in the kitchen like a guest who didn't belong. Melissa tried to redirect attention to Lily's cake, to gifts, to shallow conversation. But the atmosphere had already shifted. Her fantasy was bleeding out in front of her, exposed for what it was. And then came the absence that screamed louder than anything else. Ethan. Guests noticed immediately. They asked where he was, why he hadn't come. Melissa stumbled through weak explanations, her forced laughter betraying the tremor in her voice. "He celebrated earlier," she said, but the people remembered the man who had always been steady, present, devoted. His dignity followed him even in absence, leaving her naked under the scrutiny of family and friends. By the end of the night, the image Melissa had tried to construct lay in ruins. What she thought would look like passion now looked pathetic. What she hoped would inspire envy now invited only pity. Relatives whispered in hushed corners. "Poor Lily," one said softly. "Poor James," another added, shaking her head. The betrayal no longer lived behind closed doors. It had become public, undeniable, etched into the way her own family looked at her. Melissa had believed she could control the story, that if she smiled brightly enough, no one would see the cracks. But as the last guests left, the walls of her illusion finally collapsed. She sat at the kitchen table alone, the decorations drooping, the house eerily quiet. Derek slouched beside her, scrolling aimlessly, already half absent. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a prize. He was just a man tethered to her downfall. And Melissa realized, with a cold dread settling in her chest, that Ethan hadn't needed to shout or to expose her. His silence had done what her own actions could not hide. Her fantasy had collapsed under its own weight. The lease was signed on a cloudy Thursday morning. Ethan stood at the doorway of the new house, the key warm in his palm, its weight both strange and liberating. The place wasn't perfect. The floors were scuffed from years of wear, the cabinets sagged on tired hinges, the paint on the walls had faded to the color of old parchment. But it was his. For the first time in months, the walls around him didn't echo with betrayal. He walked slowly through each empty room, his hand brushing along door frames as if grounding himself in this fragile new reality. In the living room, he pictured Lily sprawled across a rug with crayons, James stacking blocks into towers that toppled with laughter. In the small backyard, he imagined summer nights around a fire pit, marshmallows melting into sticky smiles. The vision steadied him, gave him something to build toward. That weekend, he rolled paint across the walls until the stale air was replaced with the sharp scent of renewal. He scrubbed the cabinets until the wood grain peeked through again. He pieced together a makeshift gym in the garage, a heavy bag, a bench, a few weights. Sweat became his prayer. Labor became his medicine. Where rage once consumed him, purpose began to grow. Friends stopped by with toolboxes and six-packs, helping him patch drywall, assemble furniture, string lights across the backyard. The work was noisy, messy, imperfect, but the laughter that came with it was real, rusty at first, then freer with every passing hour. His sister visited one afternoon, pausing in the doorway, smiling softly. "This place feels like you," she said, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan believed her. Lily and James loved their weekends in the new house. They ran barefoot through the grass, their voices ringing like bells. At night, they roasted marshmallows in the backyard, their sticky fingers curling into his hand as if to anchor themselves in his steadiness. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Lily asked after their first night. Ethan pulled her close, his throat tight, his heart both aching and full. Even work began to shift. Ethan leaned into new projects, his boss noticing the fire in him. Opportunities opened, promotions, responsibilities he once hesitated to take. Instead of being weighed down, he carried himself taller, steadier. Healing wasn't fireworks. It wasn't sudden. It was brick by brick, memory by memory, in a house that slowly transformed into a sanctuary. Every stroke of paint, every laugh with his children, every drop of sweat in the garage rebuilt not just walls, but a man reborn. This wasn't exile. It was resurrection. Ethan realized betrayal hadn't left him broken. It had given him the chance to rise stronger, steadier, more himself than he had been in years. Nights in the new house were quiet in a way Ethan had almost forgotten. There were no half-whispered texts glowing in the dark, no artificial sighs meant to wound him, no weight of suspicion pressing against his chest. The silence at first felt harsh, unforgiving, even lonely. But as days passed, it became cleansing, like cool water over raw skin. One evening, he sat at the small desk in his bedroom, a yellow notepad spread before him. The lamp cast a pool of light across the page. For the first time in years, Ethan felt steady enough to write, not emails for work, not reminders for chores, but rules, not for Melissa, not for the marriage that had already crumbled, but for himself. The first rule came quickly, etched from scars still fresh: tell the truth early. He thought back to all the times Melissa's eyes had flickered with deceit, how he had convinced himself to doubt what was plain. He vowed never again to bury instinct beneath politeness. The second rule, leave before contempt grows. He remembered those months in a house where silence was sharpened into knives, where every glance was coated with disdain. He understood now contempt was not a stage to endure. It was a signal to act, a warning that should never be ignored. The third rule, choose ordinary loyalty over dramatic chaos. Derek had offered Melissa drama, the kind of passion that thrived on secrecy and stolen hours. But Ethan had seen where that path led: destruction, humiliation, regret. What mattered wasn't fireworks. It was showing up night after night with steadiness, with care. And the last rule, the hardest to write, never abandon yourself to preserve someone else's lie. That, he realized, was the mistake that had cost him most. He had bent himself smaller, swallowed unease, convinced himself to accept half-truths, all to protect the image of a marriage already bleeding out. Dignity lost is rarely regained. Better to guard it fiercely, even if it means walking away. As he pressed the pen harder into the paper, the ink smudged beneath his hand. These weren't just words. They were scaffolding, a framework for the life he was rebuilding. His children would grow up not only knowing their father had survived betrayal, but that he had refused to be defined by it. They would see him not as a man broken by lies, but as one who rose above them with clarity and resolve. In the stillness of the house, when Lily and James slept peacefully in the next room, Ethan let himself feel the scar tissue inside him. It no longer ached, it strengthened. Melissa's lies had stripped him bare. But in that bareness, he had discovered something he hadn't known he had lost, himself. He leaned back in his chair, closed the notebook, and exhaled. Pain had carved its lessons deep into him, yes, but those lessons were not chains. They were a foundation. And on that foundation, brick by brick, Ethan was building a life no betrayal could shake again. The decree arrived in a plain white envelope, the kind that usually carried bills or bank statements. Ethan slid it open at the kitchen counter, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. He read each line slowly, the words stripping away the last tether to a life he had once thought permanent. It was done, finalized, signed. The marriage was over. There was no explosion, no bitter confrontation, just the quiet weight of freedom settling over him. For months, his chest had been heavy with uncertainty, betrayal, humiliation. Now, as the ink on the decree confirmed what his heart had already accepted, that weight finally lifted. What remained was space. Space to breathe. Space to move without suspicion trailing behind him. Space to live without constantly glancing over his shoulder at the glow of a phone screen. Melissa, from what he heard in passing, remained entangled with Derek. Neighbors whispered about how awkward Derek seemed at family gatherings, how restless Melissa looked even in the arms of the man she had chosen. Once those details might have consumed Ethan, feeding the flames of bitterness. But now, standing in his own kitchen with the decree in hand, he realized something profound. He no longer cared. Her consequences belonged to her, and her alone. That evening, he stepped onto the porch of his new home. The air was cool, alive with the faint hum of crickets in the grass. He inhaled deeply, letting the night fill his lungs. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a burden to endure. It felt like a canvas waiting for color. Inside, Lily and James were asleep, their laughter from bedtime stories still echoing faintly in the walls. They were his compass now, his anchor. Everything he built moving forward would be for them, and for the man he had chosen to become. Betrayal had scarred him, yes. The wounds were real, but scars are not just reminders of pain. They are proof of survival, proof of strength. Melissa's lies no longer defined him. What defined him was this: he had refused to break, refused to beg, refused to surrender his dignity. As the moon rose over the trees, Ethan leaned against the railing of the porch. The cool night wrapped around him like a benediction. He whispered a vow, not to Melissa, not even to his children, but to himself. Never again will I abandon who I am. The night answered with steady silence, and in that silence, Ethan finally heard it, the sound of freedom. For the first time, freedom felt louder than betrayal. And so the story of she invited her lover to our child's birthday, I took back control, comes to an end. What started as a devastating betrayal ended with dignity, strength, and freedom. Ethan didn't just survive, he rose above, proving that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply moving on without regret. But now I want to ask you, if you were in Ethan's place, what would you have done? Would you have reacted differently at that birthday party? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching Cheating Stories 7. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dramatic story. Until next time, stay strong, and remember, betrayal always has a price.